I'm Dr. David Walker. I'm on the professoriate here at the University of Manitoba. I teach in wildlife and geomatics. Grasslands have been described as an upside-down forest. And so when you remove disturbance in a grassland area, and lack of management of grasslands is a kind of lack of disturbance and lack of grazing is a kind of management. If you do nothing, you are managing that landscape by default. And what you're really doing is you're allowing different kinds of strategies now to become dominant. And the dominant strategy then is to be an above ground plant, moving competition now to light above ground and becoming woody. And what that ultimately ends up doing, of course, is that it disadvantages different kinds of grass species. C4 grasses get pushed out in favor of C3 grasses, and shrubs become to dominate over grasses to the point where that ecosystem eventually does become a very shrubby ecosystem. There's various kinds of prairie, right? There's tall grass prairie, and we've got mixed and short grass prairies. And what typified all of those was a very, very rapid fire cycle. In some areas, they've said it was literally every year. Certainly that might have been the case in some locations, but it's certainly very frequent. So we're looking at every 2 to 3 years for sure. Most areas got some level of burn. And so fire was the dominant disturbance. But what fire does is it releases the productivity of a lot of these C4 grasses, and it creates a very dense grassland, and that is what bison grazed on. And so you have secondarily this disturbance by bison grazing. And bison, of course, just like all animals, they select things that they like. And so not only do you have fire selecting for fire-tolerant species, but you have bison selecting the species that they like, which changes the balance of what kinds of grasses are found in that ecosystem in general. And so bison also had the role not just of disturbance, but also in determining the composition of the kinds of species that grew there. So grasslands evolve with disturbance, and as I said before, in the absence of that disturbance, you shift the system towards taller, woodier things because they don't have to worry, in quotes, about being disturbed. You can have a tall tree if it's not going to get burned down. And so in the absence of those fires, these are native species, but they were kept in relatively low abundance. And now with the absence or management by absence, we now have these dominating systems where they didn't dominate it before. And then deer coming in and taking some of the prairie elements, the forbs, out of the system. And you're left with sort of a degenerate C3 grass shrubland as opposed to an actual healthy prairie with deep roots and building prairie soils and sequestering carbon. We move away from that system. Tall grass prairie is one of the most productive ecosystems. If you look at total biomass, it's one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. And species grow fast, they support large ungulates like bison and so forth. And those are the ones that we've converted because they are very productive. Now, they're still productive, but they're productive for canola and wheat and soybean and not for native species. And so while cropland is important and agricultural production of plant materials is important, cattle grazing and ranchers are a group that can actually, with good management practices, support a diversity of species that you can't get from a cropland. Croplands are the exact antithesis of a diverse ecosystem, right? Whereas you can grow cows on an otherwise diverse grassland. The idea of trying to use cattle to replicate bison really is to make sure that they eat as broad a diet as possible. And so, whatever strategy works to doing that, and grazing them in a small area over a period of time might be one of those ways. There's ungulates, native ungulates and pronghorn and white-tailed deer, and they eat prairie plants, but a lot of these other species are not grass specialists, so you end up with them shifting to the forbs a lot of times, especially for white-tailed deer. And so you end up shifting out and removing a lot of the broadleaf species that are really important. And a lot of our endangered species are those broadleaf species. So cows eat the grass primarily, and that gives room for these rare broadleaf species that they might not otherwise choose to eat. And so, those persist, whereas a lot of other native ungulates actually target those species. So again, if you want a healthy grassland, you really want to have something that's primarily focused on the grass, and that's what cows do. That's what bison would have historically done. But slight dietary differences that you need to use management to, as I say, try to mitigate in the case of grasses that cattle might not otherwise choose first. Make them choose them eventually, using some kind of a management strategy, and that really is what gives you a healthy grassland. And so cattle farming is a very viable option from an ecosystem management perspective.